I think one of the things that we've seen in the Ukraine conflict is that there is a bit of a narrative that there haven't been many cyber conflicts. And I think to some degree that's true, but it's not entirely true. And I think this panel is actually a really interesting piece, because what we have seen is that this hybrid warfare idea. So I think when people are thinking about cyber attacks, they're thinking about things that are debilitating in and of themselves. And I don't think that's what we've seen. I think what we've seen are sort of disruptive attacks. And I want to give a few examples. So in the lead up to the invasion, one of the things that we saw relatively early on, even before the invasion actually started, was a series of DDoS attacks. And we saw them sort of popping up in different places, and they weren't particularly sophisticated attacks, but they were on things like banks and critical infrastructure, and things that actually matter to real people. So if the site goes down, it has an effect on real people. And I think you can ask yourself, what is the intention of an attack like that? But ultimately, it sort of felt like there was an intent to make the population worry, right? Things are going to work. Things aren't going to work. Things are going to be problem, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I want to give another example, because I think, again, this idea of a blended attack is a really interesting one. So one of the things that we saw, so actually after that piece, we actually realized we could play a role. So I will say, we realized that the kind of company that we are, we could actually help prevent a lot of those attacks. So we reached out to a bunch of Ukrainian organizations and started onboarding so we could actually make sure those attacks didn't have an effect. And then I guess I want to push a little later in the conflict. So early May, one of the things that we saw was that the Russians started occupying different places in Ukraine. And we saw that they occupied Kherson. And one of the things we saw, if you were watching sort of connectivity in Kherson, you saw the connectivity drop off. So the idea of an internet shutdown as a tool of war, potentially, so that people couldn't get access. And then what happened next was really interesting. If you were watching, if you're in the sort of network space and you understand how traffic flows, you saw the traffic get rerouted. So instead of going through the normal course, it started going through Russian telecoms, which have a lot of different screening mechanisms on them, which actually can change what individuals see. So just to give an example of things that you saw, none of those are things that are debilitating cyber attacks. They aren't what people have in mind as, we've seen something that's a significant cyber attack, but they certainly had an effect. I think there's been a pretty significant effort to think about how we can share, including actually some efforts at WEF. I think one of the things that we've seen a lot is there's a recognition of exactly that point, right? There's a recognition that a lot of what happens and the visibility is in the private sector, but a lot of the action potentially is on the government side. And I think we are starting to learn new ways to do that. I think one thing to sort of flag on the cyber sharing side, we have to think about ways of doing it across borders effectively, where it doesn't raise broader concerns, right? So we're not talking about sharing personal data. We're not talking about sharing. We're thinking about sharing things that are potentially effective. And I think it's a very important piece, because we need to build systems and muscles that enable us to do it. I also actually just quickly want to jump in on the norms point. I think one thing that is worth thinking about on the norms piece, particularly in the conflict area, there are norms around armed conflict that have been around for a very long time. So if you think about international humanitarian law and sort of underlying principles of being proportionate in your targeting, making sure that it's necessary and proportionate from a military necessity standpoint, not targeting civilians, right? These are all concepts that can be applied. I think the point, though, is it's very challenging to figure out how they apply in cyberspace and to what extent there's overlap. And I think that's the work that needs to be done. I think this conflict will help draw it out in some way. The thing I would add to that on the tech accord side, I agree with all that. I think the thing I would add to that on the tech accord side, and I think one of the sort of objectives of the tech accord going into the norms conversation was they set up a set of principles that a lot of different companies can agree to. And the idea is, if you have enough private sector companies, and not just the big companies, the small companies, the medium-sized companies, agreeing to a set of principles that you weren't going to be used for attack purposes, right? That you're going to protect all your customers everywhere, which is one of those concepts, that you're going to be sharing, you're building something bigger than yourself. So the idea that I think all of us, from a company standpoint, you look at those principles and you think, that's something that I agree to, that our companies agree to, that we want to be part of, and that's a big deal. And I think you realize you have a collective voice that's bigger than